Well, Shady Rest wasn't built until I think a year and a half after the burning of Halfway. Halfway was burned in 24, spring of 24. And Shady Rest was built, I think, in 25, 26. When you talk about local history, you have to be very careful, because some of you may be relatives of people that are in this book. So,
do you know what street in West City that Joe Adams lived?
I've looked for it, and that entire area has been changed by 57 coming through. I think 57's right away is right over right near where the house was. He was mayor of West City and was also the leading bootlegger of that city. Politics being what it is, then and now.
Yeah. And where was the airfield at where they was going to supposed to try to bomb Shady Rest? Where did they?
Well, that wasn't supposed. They actually did it.
Well, they actually were going to try to burn it down.
Yeah.
Charlie Birger was duds or whatever.
Yeah, they were all duds. None of them.
Where was the airfield that they took off from? Was it Marion or?
No, it wasn't. It was further north, and I think it was just a flat field. I don't think it was an airfield. There were two barnstormers that they got together with. They said, "We'll give you a car if you fly." But we're not even sure who was the bomber. It could have been Blackie Arms, or it could have been Ray Walker. We just don't know. But somebody dropped them out, and they, of course, missed them by a mile.
It's amazing to me how many roadhouses in the world reading some of the books, you know, but just there along even the road there between the Stalo Road, you know, just the number of ones that I thought, how many places can you have on that short of this?
Miners, my contention is that extraction businesses, whether it's timber, whether it's herding cattle, or mining coal, requires a lot of young men to come and do the work, because it's a young man's game. Heavy, hard, dangerous work. And young men have certain recreational needs, which there are people more than willing to supply. As I told Dixie earlier this evening, you cannot violate the law of supply and demand. If the demand is there, somebody's going to fill the supply. It's just as simple as that. Prohibition created an enormous demand, and the entrepreneurs, young men generally, were prepared to risk being arrested to make the effort to supply the demand.
Do these all look like houses?
Yeah, well,
I mean, not like what we think of today, like taverns.
The taverns in Heron just took the signs down and painted the windows black, and they just went on with their regular business for 2 years, from 1920 to 1922. The single event that changed everything in Williamson County was the Lister Mine Massacre. Once the people that were accused of the crime were in both trials were acquitted, the Ku Klux Klan arose as a law and order league organization. They weren't this anti-black or anti-Jewish group that we're familiar with. They were law and order people, and the original Klan was made up of the best people in Williamson County.
Like vigilantes, you call them.
What's that, Jim?
Like a vigilante, you call them.
Yeah, they were vigilantes, and but they had a reason for gathering together, because the law enforcement people, like I said, they knew what was going on at Halfway and all these other places. People drove to these places to park, and here's a house with 12, 15 cars out in front of it. What do they think's going on in there? You know, I mean, roadhouses required infrastructure. You had to have a place to dispense the booze. A building, a bar, stools, chairs. You know, there was just a bunch of stuff you needed to make the sale. It would be impossible to conceal from local law enforcement what was going on in all of these places. And many of them were just mom and pop deals over by Heron. People that drop in and have a drink. I should tell you that one of the things that was done to curtail drinking in Williamson County as early as 1915, way before Prohibition, was to require that you buy whiskey only in 5-gallon bottles. You couldn't buy a drink. You could buy a 5-gallon drink, but you couldn't buy a drink. And then the county passed a local option ordinance, which meant that the township could become dry. If the township wanted to be dry and they voted dry, then no liquor was sold in that township, and that was called an anti-saloon territory. And the courthouse is filled with names of people that violated the anti-saloon territory because they just went ahead and continued to sell booze, and the fines were incredibly steep. $50 fines. Well, $50 doesn't sound much to you, but every dollar then is 20 of our dollars. Had the same equivalent buying power. So those fines were really expensive. But people were willing to risk it because the money was there. Mining camps were filled with young men who wished to drink. And some old guys, too.
Where did they get their liquor during Prohibition and afterwards? Did they get it locally, or did they bring it in?
Just south of Harrisburg, there's a range of hills. It was loaded with stills. Loaded with stills. Charlie had on retainer probably 20 or 30 stills that supplied him with all of the moonshine that he could possibly use in all of his places. The Sheltons got their whiskey off the coast of Florida, and then they would drive it up through Tennessee to Charlie's place and then on up to East St. Louis, and they sold real whiskey, which went for a lot more money than moonshine. Then that, because of the police finally caught on where the routes were, they had to change the routes over to New Orleans and up the river to southern Illinois. There are two main roads, one catty corner on 24, you might think, and then over to New Orleans and up what would we call 65. But none of those roads existed. They were all just dirt roads in those days.
Is there any one place where you could find like several photos or like just a collection of photos from that era?
Williamson County Historical Society has a number of photos of mines, miners, and
I was talking more on the lines of Charlie and his cohorts.
well, of course, there's the famous photo of the entire gang here.
I've seen that photo. Well, I asked my grandfather, supposedly he was a friend with Charlie. My grandfather was born in 1895,
Mm-hmm.
and he died mid-50s. And supposedly he was fairly decent friends, but on speaking terms with Charlie. And there's a photo somewhere of them together, somewhere within the family.
Well, it might be in a family album someplace.
I've not been able to find.
Yeah.
I've heard, and it may not be. It's one of those things that may have been stretched and stretched and stretched, but I've always wanted to see
Well,
it.
do you think it's plausible?
Yes, very plausible.
Yeah. Charlie didn't mind his photo being taken with anybody.
That's dad of my father always told me that Grandpa talked about him being a really nice guy, that he was always good, really good to kids.
Yeah, he'd throw money to children.
Yeah, he told me he was always good to kids.
Yeah. That's why the killing of that woman is what turned Williamson County against him. Had he continued just to kill other criminals, he would never have been hanged. Never. Of course, times were changing. By 29, the mines were having trouble. The sale of coal was going down as railroads switched over from coal to diesel fuel. Businesses began to use much cleaner energy sources. We began to get hydroelectric power. Coal just took a nosedive. Many of our mines here in Williamson County just ceased operation.